Hello and welcome to Autology, the weekly podcast that brings you the latest on automotive technology. This week's episode is called Chip Crisis, the Never-Ending Story. And you're here with me, Anna Büttner, and Phil Almsrud, Senior Principal Analyst for the Automotive Semiconductor Research Area with a special focus on ADAS and autonomous vehicles, alongside Nimish Ashar, Associate Director in the EE and Semiconductor domain for automotive here at S&P Global Mobility. Hello to you both, and thank you for joining this week's episode of Autology.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Hi, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, great to have you. And the title says it all. So let's jump right in and let me ask you this first question. Is there still a shortage of semiconductors in the automotive industry? Phil, maybe you can start out.
Sure, there still is. It's getting less attention now than it certainly was a year ago. 2021 was an exceptional year. There were a number of black swan events, the fire, the ice storm, not to mention just the general constraint on MCUs. So we've worked our way through all of those transients. Now we're kind of in the boring phase of kind of establishing the new normal. Not to mention that there have been some other headlines out there this year. There's this war in Ukraine, gas prices, baby formula, at least in the U.S. and elsewhere. So semiconductors are not bubbling to the top like they were a year ago. And really, what's happening now is last year was all about not having enough MCUs. Now it's about not having kind of the mature process node stuff. So we kind of lump that all into analog. So consider it like 45 nanometers and bigger process nodes, the stuff that automotive just loves using because it's cost effective, it's reliable. But those things are really where the constraints are. Although MCUs still have their own unique challenges.
Very good. So yeah, so still issues that need to be addressed. Maybe some other areas have improved, but Nimish, then let me ask you this question. By what degree are raw materials supplies affecting chip supplies? If you could comment on that.
I think there have been some key materials that have kind of taken the limelight. And these are things such as neon gas, predominantly, but also palladium. Now, with neon gas, we haven't really seen too many concerns raised by chip manufacturers in terms of the lack of supply. If we go back to a few years ago when the Russian invasion, the Russian conflict, at that time, prices really went up, but there wasn't really many places that created difficulties in supplies. So this time round, we're kind of seeing that foundries are stocking more than 6 months supplies. And, it's kind of not coming to any danger part in terms of affecting the chip manufacturing process. And at the same time, after the last conflict, there have been alternative sources of where neon gas can be purified, like in South Africa, in China. So a lot of the areas or the lack of availability from neon gas, with Russia and Ukraine's being the key areas, are kind of alleviated with all these secondary sources that can now fill the gaps. In saying that, like I've mentioned before, that many of the larger foundries have 6 months, 8 months worth of supplies. So they don't see this. And maybe this will become an issue in late 2022, early 2023. But maybe there could be some smaller issues seen at the smaller foundries that don't have the capacity to kind of store as much and to have all these elements, but nothing has come to the limelight as yet. The other side is the palladium. And until very recently, and even now, in fact. Most of it comes from Russia and Ukraine, but there have not been any sanctions levied against the supply of palladium. And there are alternative metals, although it would be preferable to use the palladium. So at the moment, I do not see too much in terms of problems from a palladium supply either. So at the moment, we see that these could have longer term effects on the market, but until the end of this year, first quarter of next year, we don't really see much in terms of movement and risk to the chip supply.
Okay, very good. Yeah, very interesting. Thank you for your insights here. What about all the investments being announced about fab expansion from TSMC, Samsung, and Intel? Won't those help?
Eventually they will. Two things going on there. On the one hand, most of that investment, we estimate somewhere, north of 85% of the expansion investment is, say, at the 10 nanometers and smaller nodes. And those are good for memories, those are good for SoCs, those are good for, very advanced ICs, which are making their way into automotive. But by and large, right now, automotive is still using more of the legacy products that I'd mentioned earlier. So 45 nanometers and bigger for MCUs, for power supplies, for everything. So eventually all those investments in those advanced process nodes will help automotive as, IVI and ADAS, to mention a couple of applications, will start being bigger users of SoCs and memory. That will help. But in the short term, you're not going to see a lot of that investment help with MCUs or the legacy analog type devices that automotive uses. And that's kind of what's furthering that challenge is more and more of the semiconductor companies have started, well, years ago, they started moving to what they call an asset light manufacturing model. And that's continuing. So essentially, you've got less and less of that stuff being produced in-house by semiconductor companies, more and more of it's being produced by foundries, and most of the foundry investment is happening at more advanced process nodes. Then automotive is a big consumer of at this point.
Okay, understood. Phil, you mentioned asset light. Can you explain that a little bit further and what you really mean by that?
Sure. So, this goes back, 20, maybe even 30 years ago at this point. Before foundries and companies like TSMC were in existence, you would have semiconductor companies that would develop their own internal processes, and then they would build that stuff within their factories, which was kind of an asset heavy model. They would have to put all the investment in place. If just to pick on NXP, if NXP wanted to build a new widget, they had to go buy the equipment, they had to go build the factory, they had to put all that stuff in place internally. So that was an asset heavy model for a semiconductor company where they were dependent upon themselves doing that all internally. Asset light was kind of the flip side of that, where it was like, how can we do less of that stuff in-house, except for the stuff that we really, really, really have to do ourselves? So the asset light model was, hey, if it's product that, it's not, maybe of strategic importance, or there's already foundry capacity out there, or otherwise I don't have to make the investment in that expansion as a semiconductor company. I can go use a foundry partner to build that for me. That was the asset light model. So really what it did in the short term was it pushed more and more of that manufacturing capacity out of the semiconductor companies and into the foundries. What has happened over time is that the foundries have continued to develop more advanced process nodes. So not only do the semiconductor companies not have the internal capacity now, the internal capacity they have tends to be on more mature processes, and they're allowing the advanced processes to be handled by their foundry partners.
Very good. So really the focus on partnering and collaborating here to then also be able to focus on the more advanced technologies. Yeah.
There's that. And I guess in fairness to the semiconductor companies too, though, fabs are expensive. It's one thing when it was $1 billion to build a fab. Now it's $10 billion. I think Intel's expansion in Ohio is going to be $20 billion. You got to have pretty deep pockets to be able to do that, and it becomes less and less practical for more and more semiconductor companies to do that themselves and be cost effective at it, because the only way you make money fabricating semiconductors is to have your lines running at 85-90%. So that was the other kind of, from an operational standpoint, the other thing that was the incentive, whether it was kind of cheaper for everybody to have that concentrated in fewer and fewer foundries, so that they were always running at very high efficiency.
Makes sense. Very good. Nimish, let me ask you this question then. What are OEMs doing to overcome some of the chip shortages currently?
Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, there doesn't seem to be a single mode of operation for all these OEMs. From selection of OEMs, they're all using different mechanisms to overcome these chip shortages. Now, some of the examples I'll give you are BMW have found alternative chips to kind of take over and kind of replace where they're having these shortages. But one of the issues they're having is that they don't have qualified software to match the new hardware. So they're actually selling the cars without functionality and then telling their customers that these will be updated in due course. And only last week, BMW released another section of over-the-air software to give these users never had functionality, to have functionality for things like Android or CarPlay, which weren't actually supplied when the cars were new. Stellantis, for example, have kind of taken a more drastic step in their 308s, and they've actually replaced their digital speedos back with the conventional analog ones. So they've circumvented and used older designs to overcome this lack of supply. JLR have taken it another step forward and have kind of created a mission control center where they're kind of trying to preempt the shortages, and a team of engineers, purchasers, and things like this are managing the shortages. And also at the same time, they're prioritizing the more profitable models for them. So they're kind of taking away from the lower end cars and putting them into more high end cars and kind of getting the profit levels back up. And Mercedes are using a similar type of mechanism to JLR, where they're now using the chips as priority in their higher end vehicles for higher profits. So as you can see, there are kind of lots of different applications of how these OEMs are overcoming this. But it's certainly not the only ways. And, as days are unfolding, we're seeing different ways on how companies are overcoming these chip shortages.
Just to add to that, Anna, one of the other things that we've been hearing about the OEMs is, in addition to all the great examples that Nimish just listed there, the OEMs are starting to deal more directly with the semiconductor companies themselves. So they're the old hierarchical structure of the OEMs talk to the tier ones talk to the semiconductor companies, the semiconductor companies talk to the foundry partners. That's really been thrown out the window now, and everybody's talking to each other, which on the one hand, you think they're just getting to that point. But these are all large, complex organizations that have histories of doing things, and they've worked by and large. The situation we're going through since last year has really stressed all of those communications. So now you're hearing, OEMs wanting to deal directly with the semiconductor companies, talk directly to the foundries, and maybe even get to a point where the General Motors of the world will buy all the semiconductors themselves. They'll no longer be dependent on anybody else buying this stuff. They'll buy it to both establish those and maintain those relationships, but also to really use their overall leverage. And then that puts them in the middle of the conversation, so they're not going to be surprised if anything doesn't materialize as expected. So there's a lot of things going on there that's changing, the content going in cars, but also some of the organizational structures and relationships as a result of what we went through last year and are still going through.
Yeah, I would agree there that, you even kind of see the whole dynamics of the automotive industry changing on this basis, where there seems to be, like you say, Phil, a significant connection between the chip makers and the final users, i.e. the OEMs. So this is where certain information wasn't always relayed from a customer request down to the chip manufacturing. Now, these bonds seem to be getting stronger. And even for OEMs to have the direct support of the chip manufacturers should also provide them with, stronger software development platforms and all these other elements that perhaps tier ones were providing, but not directly. So, the whole dynamics of the industry are significantly changing.
Yeah, very interesting. So yeah, OEMs are looking for creative ways in the short term to get vehicles out the door. And maybe with retrofitting or adding features later on, meaning that customers will have to bring back their vehicle if it's not just an OTA update. But then in the long term, it sounds like they're really shifting the structure of how business is being done when it comes to these semiconductors. Very interesting. Yes. Let me ask you this then. The big question and why we got together today here, and question to you both: when will the semiconductor shortage come to an end then?
Well, I think it's going to be longer than what anybody was originally expecting. When we started out last year, I think the industry's expectation was this was going to be a typical allocation event that the industry was going through, which means a couple, 3 quarters, there's a lot of pain and suffering, and then things start improving pretty dramatically after that. We're way past that 2 to 3 quarters timeline right now, and while things have improved, I mean, while we may paint things as a little gloom and doom, things are better now than they were the end of last year, and we expect things the end of this year to be better than they are at the beginning of this year. But in terms of things going back to normal being pre-2019 conditions, where you had 16-week lead times on most semiconductors or less, and the demand drove supply as opposed to being limited by supply. I think we're still a ways away from that. I mean, Intel has speculated that it's going to be 2024 before they think we're going to be through this. And I think while we expect to see continual improvements, we're going to be in this mode to a certain extent through the balance of this year and certainly the next year.
Yeah, I would also add to that, and I think, Phil, maybe you agree with this one, is that, we kind of see supplies from the semicoms improving over time, but at the same time, the evolution of automotive, cars is also driving more semiconductor devices within the cars. So we can, if we all stood still and kind of said, okay, we need, 10, 100 semiconductor devices per car, as we did in 2019, then maybe things would be improving at a much faster rate. But given the evolution of cars and how technologies are very rapidly changing, these 100 or 120 processors are becoming 150, 200 processors. And, the requirements for the number of these semiconductors is increasing too. So we kind of have two conflicting things that are not helping one another.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Nimish, is that we get into conversations with people where they'll say, hey, in 2017 we could build 97 million cars, and we struggled to build 75, 77 million cars last year. Kind of what's going on? It's like, just as Nimish said, the number of semiconductors per car is growing significantly. So you need a lot more semiconductors to build that same car and put it out on the road. So, for all of us in the semiconductor world, that's great news. One of the offshoots, I think, of this, the industry is already moving in this direction, where there's going to be, consolidation of ECUs. Instead of having 100, 120 ECUs on a car, we'll start getting different vehicle architectures that will maybe reduce some of the semiconductor content, but if not, it certainly will change the semiconductor mix. You'll start seeing MCUs replaced by SoCs, for example. So those things will help in time, but that's probably still further out than the horizon that we're looking at right now. That's probably 2025 and beyond. And here we are still at 2022 trying to figure out how to build more cars. Now, I guess I'll say this as a benefit. If inflation and other things cause other users of semiconductors to build fewer things, that will free up capacity that automotive can use, provided that there's not a downturn in demand for cars. But I would say in the short term, the most likely thing to help the automotive industry is other segments that use semiconductors using fewer of them, which means semiconductors are more available to put in cars, which is a good thing for everybody who wants to buy a new car.
Very good. Yes, thank you for your insights here. Sounds like it's a perfect storm that's not moving. The system is not moving out yet. Not quite
Not
yet.
at least. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. A big thank you to you both for joining Atology.
Our pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
And thank you to all you listeners for tuning in as well. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode at atology@ihsmarket.com email. And you can find out much more at autotechinsight.ihsmarket.com. And don't forget to hit all the subscribe, follow, and like buttons to stay on track with the latest Atology podcast. And we look forward to you joining us again in the next episode. Bye for now.